So I'm watching a bit of the dialogue between Professor Corey Anton and Richard Lang, who I believe has authored a biography of the mystic and spiritual teacher Douglas Harding, who who developed what he called a headless philosophy. And I'm not all that familiar with Douglas Harding, but the little that I have encountered his teachings, it has had an influence on me. The idea that I am faceless and that where my face should be in my experience, there is this hole, this absence, and it's in that absence that, in fact, I find the world. So my experience is always of a missing, most fundamentally, at least, most profoundly, my experience is always of being headless, of lacking a face, and in so lacking, discovering or desiring, giving rise to a world out of a desire to find my face. Or maybe that last part is something I'm adding, this notion of desire, the desire of the faceless to find the face in the world. Corey and Richard Lang sort of circled around this notion of desire, metaphysically speaking, not my desire or your desire, not merely animal desire, unless in fact God is an animal, but rather the desire of God or of the Father or the origin of finite things and the visible world. Corey was wondering if that which existed before being, that which existed before actual being at least, in any way desired to become, or if it was rather an accident that just sort of happened, or if in fact it never really happened, and our empirical egos, our daily selves, the egos that exist in the world of daily life, are in fact, Corey will relativize that ego, and in some ways phenomenologically reduce it to the true self of dreamless sleep, which always encompasses the horizon. It invisibly encompasses the horizon of our everyday experience, of our waking, rational, egoic experience. And I think Corey would probably place desire only in that animal realm and not necessarily in the metaphysical realm. So the origin of the experience of subject as over and against object, I guess for Corey, happens accidentally and not through an act of desire. This notion of the unmanifest, or of the absent father, to use mythical language, this would not in any way desire to mix with presence or existence or the visible cosmos. The cosmos would in a sense be just the dream of this really still unmanifest nothing or absence. And I can't really say where Richard Lang is going. I think he's just beginning to speak here about his perspective. He Lang has just said that he thinks that this experience of having no face is both private and public. And Corey came back to say, well, I'm having thoughts here in my presence to myself that are not immediately available to you in your own presence to yourself. So there are private thoughts, right? And maybe, I would say with Corey that I'm having perceptions over here that are associated with my body, with this organism, with this nervous system, that are not immediately experienced perceptually in terms of being received by the nervous system of someone else. But when I'm truly thinking, when I'm creating or relating to concepts, it doesn't make sense to say that they are private. True thinking is neither public nor private, I would say. Particular thoughts maybe would be private, which is, I think, what Corey is trying to bring up here as a problem. But concepts themselves, the ideas which do the thinking, they're not public or private merely. They're not simply subjective or simply objective, because of course subject and object are concepts. So thinking itself, the activity of conceptualization that we call thinking cannot be subjective or objective if subject and object are themselves concepts conceived in the act of thinking. So thinking withdraws from either category, from either the public, commonly available phenomena of the external world, or from the private, internally withdrawn phenomena or phantasms of the inner imagination. Now I've just dropped a word, imagination, that I think can serve as a sort of placeholder to move forward. For me, I've just been reading John Sallis. He's a phenomenological philosopher who does a lot of work on the Platonic dialogues, and also on imagination as it relates to philosophy and the history of philosophy. I've been reading his book here, Force of Imagination, and he discusses Kant and Fichte and really Schelling and Hegel too, and the way that German Romanticism at that period in time around the turn of the 19th century, how they radicalized an ancient understanding of imagination such that it was no longer a faculty or power of the subject, no longer merely a subjective power, in other words, but an ontological force, or perhaps a cosmic force, something which pre-exists both thought and nature, and from out of which both thought and nature reveal themselves or come to presence amidst. So imagination is ontologized, and the way that Fichte puts this is quite fascinating. He says, "It is therefore here taught in Fichte's system that all reality, for us being understood, as it cannot be otherwise in a system of transcendental philosophy, all reality is brought forth solely by the imagination." And then he also quotes Hegel later, who says, in an early text called Faith and Knowledge, Hegel says, "We must not take imagination," the German is Einbildungskraft. "We must not take imagination as the middle term that gets inserted between an existing absolute subject and an absolute existing world. It must rather be recognized as what is primary and original, and as that out of which the subjective I and the objective world first sunder themselves." This is also very similar to what the English Romantic poet and philosopher, or poet-philosopher Coleridge defined imagination as. And of course Coleridge was drawing on the German Romantics to do this. Coleridge defined imagination in the sense that Fichte and Hegel understood it, the primary imagination, as the living power, this is Coleridge, the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and imagination is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So the imagination isn't something that isn't a faculty of the subject or a faculty of the soul, a power of the soul that would, after the fact, after a sensory perception of the body, sort of remember and allow us to reconstitute in subsequent inner experiences or representations. The imagination isn't simply representative of objects or two subjects. For the German idealists and for the English romantics, romantic poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, and others, the imagination was God, was the creator of both nature and the human, of both cosmos and anthropos. And this experience, I think, of facelessness, the way that Douglas Harding would talk about it, sounds very similar to me to what phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty would call the flesh, or the chiasm, that which exists in between my embodied perception and my opening to the world, or the way that the world is folded into me, my opening to your fold as a sort of constitutive factor in my own coming to self-presence, so that whatever I am, whatever the cogito is, the thing that thinks in me, and that so exists as who I am, whatever that is, it only exists because you exist. So there's an intersubjective priority here, or origin of separate subjects, that I think this notion of facelessness sort of points to. YouTube in many ways intensifies this duplicity in subjectivity. It further folds intersubjectivity upon itself, and in that sense, I think, allows us to become conscious of our own thought process, of our own thinking activity, in entirely unforeseen ways. We're developing new organs of perception here, and it's a bit like learning how to drive a spaceship that we found somewhere on a beach, crash landed, and not really understanding how its control board works. If you'll excuse the extraterrestrial metaphor. So, yeah, just some reflections. I'm going to continue watching this dialogue here between Professor Anton and Richard Lang, and I might have a little bit more to say.